we can do for the world, both on the field and in the pool and on the track, but also in the infrastructure area, in creating a world-class event that Australia can do better than anywhere else in the world. And I look forward to watching the development over coming years. I do want to say as well that the Jobs and Skills Summit is taking place. We are having forums today in Canberra. There's a forum from disability workers, and it's examining the ways in which we can increase the employment of people with disabilities and also skill up people. I spoke to a forum last night, but throughout Australia we're having regional meetings, we're having meetings aimed at particular sections of the community, talking about how we can expand jobs and skills, how we can lift wages. We know that today's figures show a 3.5% decline in real wages, with the wage figure of 2.6 compared with the annual inflation rate of 6.1. It's another reminder that wages were going backwards. There was no plan to lift wages. We want to work with business, to work with unions, to work with the non-government sector to advance Australia's interests going forward. Happy to take questions.
Scott Morrison insists appointing himself to 5 additional portfolios would shield the nation from unforeseen challenges. And the fact that he didn't tell most ministers because he didn't exercise the power to work with him. What are your thoughts on this? And do you have any further information on what instructions were made at the school as to why the documentation wasn't published?
Well, the first rule of Power Grab Club is don't talk about Power Grab Club. And Scott Morrison broke that rule today. Scott Morrison was evasive, he was defensive, he was passive-aggressive, and of course he was self-serving. So at least he was true to himself today. What we saw was all of his characters on full display, blaming everyone else, not accepting any responsibility, saying, for example, that somehow when he said he was taking the decision on the resources as Resources Minister, when he said, I'm making this decision as Prime Minister, everyone should have known at that point in time somehow that he had sworn himself in as the Resources Minister in order to make that decision. His extraordinary comments that he said, where he gave a press conference and said that he made the conscious decision to not tell his cabinet colleagues that he had also occupied their space as Treasurer, as Finance Minister, as Industry, Science, Energy and Resources Minister, as Home Affairs Minister, that somehow he didn't want it to be misinterpreted, which is why he didn't tell anyone. The fact is there were at least 3 documents provided. The Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, I wrote to them today asking that in the public interest, after questions have been raised with the Department and with myself at yesterday's press conference, that it be released, the documentation of appointment signed by the Governor-General. Those documents have now been released. Why there wasn't any statement made at the time is incomprehensible to me. It is a government not being transparent, and this was a shadow government. It's one thing to have a shadow ministry. This was a shadow government, so that Josh Frydenberg and Matthias Cormann and Karen Andrews and others weren't even told, nor were the secretaries of departments like Treasury and Home Affairs. So that when the incident occurred on May 21, where you had that release of the text messages about at the arrival of a boat, Karen Andrews, who'd got the phone call, according to her, from Scott Morrison asking for a release to be made in breach of what had been the government policy, including under Minister Morrison when he had responsibility for that. At no stage did we know that Minister Morrison had in fact been appointed as Minister for Home Affairs as well. Now, it's one thing for his ministerial colleagues to not be told, and I noticed in the part of the press conference that I watched, and I watched most of it before we began the event here today, Mr Morrison spoke about apologising to his ministerial colleagues for how they felt. Not that he'd done anything wrong, he accepted no responsibility. But how about an apology to the Australian people? The Australian people went to an election not knowing that any of this had occurred, not knowing that there was a shadow government operating in darkness without transparency, a clear misleading of the parliament whereby parliamentarians and ministers are held to account for areas in which they have responsibility. We asked questions about PEP 11, specifically in the House of Representatives, and at no stage did Minister Pitt or Prime Minister Morrison at the time say, well, actually, that was a decision made by Minister Morrison, not as Prime Minister, but as Minister for Resources.
Do you think those actions were legal and in the national interest? Has there been any more consideration for a review or an informal investigation?
Well, I've asked for an opinion from the Solicitor General. The question for Mr Morrison is, what advice did he get from the Solicitor General before he made these decisions? We know that he made a request of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. The Prime Minister and Cabinet Department provided a brief for him to sign. He then signed off on a letter to the Governor-General, and the Governor-General made the appointments upon the recommendation of the government of the day. We will receive that advice, I'm advised, on Monday. That will be considered advice from the Solicitor General, and that is appropriate because there are reasons why there are checks and balances in our democratic system. The reason why you have one minister who's responsible for making decisions about resources or about environment or about immigration, and by being sworn in, of course, to the Home Affairs portfolio, it also confuses that role potentially as well. The legal implications for this will be considered by the Solicitor General. That advice will come to the government, and we'll make decisions about a way forward based upon that. But this only came about, be very clear, this came about because Scott Morrison was getting a biography written of him with a couple of journalists who published this on Saturday, and then bit by bit information came out. And yesterday morning, Scott Morrison on 2GB said he couldn't recall any additional appointments beyond the 3 which had already been released. Now, he couldn't remember the fact that he had been appointed to administer the Treasury portfolio and the Home Affairs portfolio. I mean, give me a break. This is a guy who, and a government, with Peter Dutton sitting there, and yesterday Peter Dutton said very clearly that everyone should just move on. It was like nothing to see here. We've just had this shadow government operate, but ask me questions about something else, please. Well, he sat there in the Cabinet as well when Scott Morrison was appointed himself as the sole member of a Cabinet committee simply so that he could avoid scrutiny in any meetings that he held with other ministers. He could say they'd been co-opted onto that committee of one. It's a farce. This was a slippery slope that Scott Morrison went down, that Peter Dutton and the rest of his cabinet went along with. Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year for 4 years. For 4 years, this guy stood at press conferences and said, for example, in the United States, the issue of invites to the White House was just gossip when he knew that it wasn't gossip, it was fact.
Will the MNP's investigation be able to reveal if Mr Morrison used his powers as a Prime Minister other than that Channel 11 project, or does it not have a scope to do that?
I've asked for advice about that, but quite clearly, given the fact that Mr Morrison wasn't even transparent yesterday morning on 2GB, then I don't think it's possible to take what he has said at face value. So we will ask for, we've asked for advice. We await that advice.
When might that advice go to? Julian Hill has called for the resignation of the Governor-General. Is that the position of the White Caucus?
It's not my position as Prime Minister. I have no intention of undertaking any criticism of the Governor-General. The Governor-General acted in accordance with the recommendations of the government of the day. The government of the day has to accept responsibility for this, and the people who are involved in it directly have to accept responsibility. If there are any changes that are required or recommended from any future examination of this, and quite clearly it does need to be examined. It's not in spite of what Peter Dutton thinks is appropriate. It's not going to just move on here. This is fundamentally a trashing of our democratic system, a trashing of the conventions and rules that have operated in Australia for 121 years. This is unprecedented, and that is why our democracy is in retreat worldwide. I don't know if other people have noticed that. There are people fighting now in Ukraine to protect democracy and a sovereign nation. You have a rise of undemocratic regimes. We cannot be taken for granted. Our democracy is precious. We need to defend it and strengthen it, not undermine it, which is what the former government has done.
As Prime Minister of Australia's Parliament, do you think there is a place in that Parliament for the current member of Cook?
I think if I was a voter in Cronulla or Caringbah, and I heard my local member say that he didn't follow day-to-day politics, then I think I would want something a bit better than that.
When might that advice go to, Prime Minister? The advice from the Solicitor General? You get on that.
I don't second guess. The difference between me and the former government is that I am running an orderly, proper government that obeys the rules and conventions of the Westminster parliamentary system. Part of that is issues of taking proper advice. We've asked for advice through the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet from the Solicitor General. That is an appropriate course to take, and I won't preempt that.